Okay, it's 10:03. I will bid you good morning again and say welcome to the 2026 Senate Bill 1 Program's Alternate Delivery Methods Workshop. As a reminder, anytime we say we or us during this workshop, we are referring to Commission staff. I am Naveen Habib, and I manage the Solutions for Congested Corridors program. I am joined by Matthew Yasgod, Deputy Director of SB1 Programming, to cover today's workshop, where we will address proposed updates to the delivery methods and project segmenting provisions included in the draft 2026 Senate Bill 1 program guidelines. Just some quick housekeeping reminders. Each attendee is registered with a unique webinar access link. Please do not share this link. It is associated with your individual registration and may result in access issues or confusion during the session. In the webinar control panel, there are two icons. You can use the raise hand feature to make a public comment. Begin each comment by stating your name and organization. Use the Q&A feature to submit written comments. Commission staff will read the comment aloud during the meeting. A few notes on format. Staff will develop recommendations based on today's discussion and your feedback. And to keep this session focused, topics covered in earlier workshops will not be revisited unless we determine it is necessary. You may raise your hand or submit a question at any point during our presentation. We will ensure all comments are addressed in the order received. If you have multiple questions, please share them one at a time so that we may address each question in its entirety before moving on to the next one. And as a quick reminder, this presentation is recorded and all materials, including the presentation and recording, are posted on the Commission's website after the workshop. You may recall we are developing these guidelines for the fifth funding cycle of Senate Bill 1 programs. Commission program guidelines establish the policy, standards, and procedures for the development, adoption, and management of its programs. These guidelines also address statutory requirements, incorporate stakeholder input, and include Commission procedures for programming and project delivery. The guidelines development process relies heavily on the discussions in which we engage with our commissioners, the Equity Advisory Committee, and a wide range of stakeholders, which include local, regional, and state government and transportation planning agencies, private enterprises, non-governmental and nonprofit organizations, community advocacy groups, and members of the public. Stakeholder input is an essential part of the guidelines development process. Since the kickoff last November, we have held monthly public workshops and virtual office hours with all of our attendees, and all materials are posted on the Commission's website. Before I dive in, any questions about the logistics? Okay. I don't see any raised hands or any questions, so I'm going to move on to the purpose of this workshop. Today, we are addressing proposed updates to the delivery methods provisions in the Senate Bill 1 programs. Increasingly, implementing agencies are using or considering using alternate delivery methods such as design build, progressive design build, and construction manager general contractor, or CMGC, to deliver projects. These guidelines updates revise outdated information and clarify procedures for alternate delivery methods. And because these updates span all four programs, we are hosting this focus session so stakeholders can weigh in before the Commission considers the guidelines for adoption in August. The proposed framework is adapted from and is consistent with the Commission's adopted State Highway Operation and Protection Program guidelines, or SHOP guidelines for short, which means that this approach is not new per se. So these are the current guidelines that you see on the slide right now. This is an excerpt from the Solutions for Congested Corridors program guidelines. Again, it's just used as an example. It's pretty much the same as what's included in the Local Partnership Program guidelines and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program guidelines. I'm not going to read the slide. We shared the slide and the materials beforehand with everybody at the workshop, so I'm going to move on to the meat of the purpose of why we're here at the workshop today, to cover the proposed updates that we're making to the existing language. As you can see on this slide, the proposed changes apply to the delivery methods section in all four draft 2026 Senate Bill 1 program guidelines. This includes the Local Partnership Competitive Program, the Local Partnership Formulaic Program, Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, and Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. The changes can be reviewed in the workshop reference materials that were posted online and included in the slides that follow this one. Proposed changes are shown in bold red on both documents. So I'm going to start at the top here, and I'll read the first line and kind of follow up on why I'm reading the first line. So the first line is, the Commission supports and encourages innovative delivery methods. Projects may use design build, progressive design build, or construction manager general contractor delivery in accordance with the statutory authority applicable to the implementing agency and or the mode being delivered. So, one point on that sentence, the guidelines do not grant or restrict contracting authority. Each implementing agency is responsible for confirming and operating under its own authority for its projects. We would like your feedback today on whether this framing gives applicants what they need. If you think this is clear, concise enough, or if you think we need to make any changes to make it more inclusive or more exclusive, just let us know. I'm going to pause there before I move on to the next section, which is programming and allocation, and see if anybody has any questions or comments before I move along. Okay, seeing none. And again, quick reminder, you can ask questions at any time or put them in the Q&A, and we're happy to respond to them as we go along. You do not have to wait until the end of the presentation. That said, moving on to programming and allocation. For design build and progressive design build projects, the Commission will program funds in the construction component of the project. The allocation, however, may be a combined amount that includes design, right-of-way, and construction, reflecting how these contracts are typically structured. For projects that are using these methods, a guaranteed maximum price, or a GMP as it's colloquially known, I think, must be established before the construction phase allocation. There are three related provisions to this. If the final guaranteed maximum price, or GMP, exceeds programmed amounts, any cost increase is subject to the existing cost increase limits in the program guidelines. If the parties do not reach agreement on a guaranteed maximum price, or GMP, the implementing agency may exercise the off-ramp provided under its contract, and the agency shall notify Commission staff as soon as the need to off-ramp is identified. Because the off-ramp changes the delivery method on a program project, the change is processed through the existing project amendment process that is established in program guidelines and does not extend timely use of funds deadlines. The practical takeaway, if I put it simply, is that you should talk to us early and keep us in the loop. And allocations will not be approved before environmental clearance is achieved for the entire project. Again, that is existing program policy in all Senate Bill 1 program guidelines, and it's restated here so it is clear that it applies regardless of delivery method. I'm going to pause here, and I have a question in the Q&A. It's from Honora Borden. Hello. Does the information laid out in this section mean that early works packages under PDB will be under PS&E allocations even if they include construction? It's a great question, Honora. If you don't mind holding on to that until I get to the next section, and then if it's answered, you can respond back in the chat. If it's not, then I'll follow up on that question directly. Okay, so I'm going to move on really quick to definitions. So progressive design build and construction manager general contractor projects may be divided into segments or work packages. These are two different things. A segment is a portion of a project that has independent utility. It is usable on its own and delivers standalone benefits. And segments are the units the Commission programs and evaluates. A work package is a contracting and delivery bundle within a project or segment, such as grading, demolition, utility relocation, or long lead procurement. A work package is not required to have independent utility because it is a construction management tool, not a programming unit. And this distinction aligns the guidelines with federal regulations and standard industry practice. I'm going to pause here. And I see another question from Nicolette Chan. Must a guaranteed maximum price be established for all project segments or work packages, or just the segment funded by the CTC? That's a great question, Nicolette. I would say that it needs to be established because we typically fund a project, at least because we typically fund the entirety of the project, then I believe the GMP should be established for any part of the project that needs to be delivered with CTC funds on it. Sometimes we segment out, like we said, larger projects into smaller segments. As long as the segment has CTC funding on it, you need to reach GMP before allocation. Hopefully that answers your question. And Anora, I still have your question, and I'm going to follow up on it based on the information provided on the next slide. Nicolette, let me know if I answered your question or if you have any follow-ups. I see a question from Hisham. Thank you, Nicolette. Awesome. I'm going to move on to Hisham Noemi's question. I am assuming the guidelines apply to STIP funds as well, correct? Well, Hisham, the fun part of the answering this question is that this workshop pertains to the Senate Bill 1 program guidelines, for which we are in open workshop mode right now. So right now, all the changes that we are discussing today apply to the guidelines included in the 2026 Senate Bill 1 programs, which includes the Local Partnership Competitive Program, the Local Partnership Formulaic Program, the Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. So STIP changes or questions will be addressed whenever STIP guidelines are open and workshops are prepared. Hopefully that answers your question. If you have any follow-ups, let me know. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised or outstanding questions besides Anora's. Great. Thank you, Hisham. I'm going to move on to the next slide. So if a progressive design build or construction manager or general contractor project is divided into separate work packages for the construction phase, the proposed language sets out how they will be handled. So I'm going to walk you through and read it out loud so that you can follow along with me. Work packages will be programmed by the Commission through an amendment after a request from the implementing agency. Allocations for a work package will be approved only if the work package is part of a project or segment that is fully funded, meaning the current cost estimate for the entire project is within the project's committed funding. The allocation request for the initial work package must include a list of anticipated work packages with their delivery years and scopes of work, and each subsequent request must update that list. Work packages must be severable. The agency is not obligated to have the contractor construct any other portion of the work. The magnitude of the remaining packages keeps the contractor engaged for the remainder of the project, and a package must not conflict with work performed under subsequent packages. Implementing agencies must engage with Commission staff and Caltrans when considering work packages. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions before I move on to the next slide. Another question from Don Wynn. Do you know if these guidelines will also be added to the TIRCP programs? That is a great question, Don. So we are basing these changes, like I said, off of the SHOP guidelines framework that's already included in SHOP guidelines. And so this particular framework, because it builds off of that, more than likely will be amended to be included in other commission program guidelines, because delivery methods are basically a shared process across all commission programs. But any specific questions as to how that will be included in other programs will depend on when those programs open guidelines and conduct their workshops. We cannot speak to other programs on these workshops.
And Naveen, this is Matthew. I just want to add one clarifier. Since I think the question was about TIRCP, so commission staff does not oversee the facilitation of TIRCP guidelines development. That's coordinated by Caltrans and CalSTA. So this language will obviously be shared with our partners at CalSTA and Caltrans for their consideration the next time TIRCP opens up guidelines development. But it's a little more difficult for us to speak to any changes they'll propose or recommend, since Commission does not oversee the implementation of guidelines development for TIRCP.
Thanks for providing the clarification, Matthew. And let us know if that answers your question, Don, or if you have any follow-up questions. And while we're waiting on that, I'm going to go back to Anora's question. Anora, the part that I just covered right now about progressive design build projects and how they're divided into separate work packages for the construction phase, does that answer your question, or did you want me to elaborate a bit further? And give it another couple of seconds to see if Anora responds. Okay, so I'm going to elaborate a little bit further, Anora. Thanks for following up. Early work packages under Progressive Design Build or PDB that include construction activity are construction phase work, and the proposed language that you're seeing here requires that construction allocates be based on a guaranteed maximum price. If an early work package scope is severable, is part of a fully funded project or segment, and satisfies the work package requirements that you see here, it would be allocated as a construction work package, not as a PS&E expenditure. But again, like I also noted earlier, commission staff can work through the specific sequencing with any agency considering this structure. So communicate with us early and often so that we can work through any project specific questions that you may have. Because we know some issues are better dealt with on a case by case basis, but this is broadly going to cover that. Let me know if you want me to talk about it any further, Nora, or if that answers your question. Great. Awesome. Thank you. So I don't see any other hands raised or any questions in the Q&A tab. So I'm going to just elaborate a little bit further on the two bullets that you see that are highlighted. And there's a note on the slide below, but I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit further. So the highlighted notes, they're highlighted in yellow on the slide. They describe what construction allocations may fund and confirm that allocations must be based on the guaranteed maximum price, or GMP, reached with the contractor. These two provisions specifically will only be included in the Local Partnership Formulaic Program and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program guidelines, because these programs fund pre-construction phases and their guidelines need to specify what a construction allocation may cover. The Solutions for Congested Corridors program and Local Partnership Competitive Program fund only the construction phase, so the general provisions we just covered earlier already address those items for those two programs. Before I move on to the next slide, I'm going to pause for a couple of seconds and see if there are any hands raised or any questions. Jillian, go ahead.
Hi, Naveen. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Thanks so much. This is really helpful to have all of the text in front of us. I think you may know RCTC is actively working on a progressive design build project. And so really, really glad to see more extensive language being proposed for the guidelines, as it's something we've been craving for a long time. Um, I don't know if RCTC is unique in how we're delivering the PDB project we're actively working on, or not. So maybe you or someone else on the line may may be able to say, but based on how we're delivering our project, we won't reach a GMP until our progressive design builder has accomplished a certain level of design. So, like, to just kind of lay out the timeline, we cleared environmental, then we hired the progressive design builder, gave them an notice to proceed one, and that was to do sort of like some initial design, of course, that went above and beyond what's already covered by the environmental document. And that work that they're doing is helping to inform how they would ultimately build the job, and helps inform their GMP that they would provide us. So with the way it's written here, I don't feel like it's actually giving the project sponsor the ability to allocate funds for any non-construction work, like for design, for example, because we wouldn't have a GMP by then. Does that seem maybe unique to RCTC's approach to this project, or do you have any insight there?
So I'll maybe ask our engineering team to chime in, but I'm going to take a first stab at answering this question really quick. I think what you're describing, isn't that the standard PDB sequence where the PDB contractor is hired, then issued a notice to proceed for the pre-construction phase, the contractor advances the design beyond the environmental document level, the design work will inform constructability, like you're saying, risk allocation, and ultimately the price that's agreed upon. So GMP
Mm-hmm.
is established when that design work is sufficiently mature, right? So
Uh-huh.
proposed language that's up on the slide right now requires the GMP before the construction phase allocation, which is where it seems to be falling in the sequence that you are describing. But I'm gonna pause there and see if John or David have anything to add.
I'll provide some thoughts. Hi, Jillian and everybody. This is John Prey from the engineering team. Jillian, I think what you're describing sounds like work that would be done under the PS&E allocation, not the construction allocation, because it's design work that's not like part of the phase two PDB
Mm-hmm.
contract. Is that it's, I don't
Yes, 100%. But I thought Naveen was saying that there wouldn't be, if a project is using alternative delivery like PDB, that there won't be that any funds programmed by CTC would only be placed in construction phase.
Oh, Naveen, that's a SCCP question for you, I think, because these are, yes, these are related to construction allocations and
Right.
go ahead.
So, in to John's point, in SCCP, so the Solutions for Contested Corridors program and the Local Partnership Competitive program, we only allocate funds for construction. So
Right.
sometimes based on what I understand about alternative delivery methods in PDB, sometimes that's all looped together, lump sum in the GMP. And so we would allocate that as part of the construction allocation request because our programs only fund construction. That would be different under the local partnership formulaic program and the trade corridor enhancement program that do fund the previous pre-con phases before construction allocation. So that's
Mhm.
why those two bullets are clarified for those programs. But like I said, we've tried to provide a general framework and guidance here, so that we can talk about the different alternate delivery project delivery methods, but we would want to be part of the process with you so we understand what you're trying to do with your project as early and as often as possible. So I'm hoping that we answered your question, or if there's something that I'm missing, like go ahead and elaborate for me a little bit further, Jillian.
Sure. The way I'm reading the text that's on the screen is that, okay, so I'm looking at the two yellow highlighted bullets, so the first of the two on the second line, construction allocations for progressive design build projects may fund design and construction or construction only, depending how structured, and must be based on a GMP. So for LPPF and TCEP, which do fund pre-con, if the program is willing to give the project funding for design, which it says there in line 2, you wouldn't have a GMP to provide. So it's almost like I feel like there's a little extra nuance that needs to be added to the text for the LPPF and TCEP because
So Jillian, let me ask you this question. This is Matthew. And Naveen, you can let me know if you agree or disagree. So let's say we have a hypothetical project that has applied and it has been successful in TSEP. And the implementing agency knows they plan to employ progressive design build as the delivery method. Based on this being TSEP, those two lower bullets would be applicable. And in the instance that you're describing an example, Jillian, you're saying there would be very definitive design work and very definitive construction work, and RCTC may request to program those two phases, I should say, separately, which in TSEP you're able to do. Therefore, RCTC would be proposing this as a design allocation and a construction allocation. So I think in that first bullet that's highlighted, it does presume that design and construction are being allocated under construction. And so, Jillian, what you're saying is if it's actually sought to complete design work, regardless of if it's going to be in a progressive design build contract or not, you would not have a guaranteed maximum price at the time you would want to allocate design, nor do I think that bullet is suggesting that you would have to have a guaranteed maximum price. So would that be a potential, to allow, what would otherwise be progressive design build delivery through design and construction, but ultimately, allocating the design portion up front without a GMP, coming back once a GMP is achieved, requesting a construction allocation, because TSEP does allow design right of way and construction. And so I think does that kind of clarify what you're asking, Jillian? Because if that's what you're asking, I think that first bullet presumes that all of it would be requested under construction. And you're just asking, is that in conflict with one another?
That's exactly.
Essentially,
So I was going to say, Matthew, that was exactly the intent with which the language was written. So I'm just going to add a +1 to Matthew's comment.
so to make sure I understand,
I think what we're saying, Jillian, is if you request funding in design and in construction, that first bullet is not applicable with respect to having a GMP before you allocate design. But in SDCP, if you are seeking design funding tied to a progressive design build contract, because SDCP and LPP competitive will not allocate design funds, those two programs are a bit more restrictive and would require GMP prior to allocating design and construction under a construction allocation. But in TSEP, your way around having a GMP before initiating the contract is you would simply just allocate the funds in design, because that's how you would request to program them. So I think what you're saying is a nuanced approach for RCTC would actually be what we would anticipate, but it would only be a flexibility that's allowed in TSEP and LPP formula. And I also understand, there are other commission programs that we're not talking about today that do fund pre-construction as well. So with our kind of focus on the SB1 programs in my area, these I would say the most restrictive programs for this are going to be SDCP and LPP competitive. Does that?
Sure.
I think in your example, Jillian, we're just saying you would request design funds and you could allocate design and not have a GMP.
okay, got it. That from the way it was written, that wasn't
I
apparent
see-
to me, but
Yeah, I
I'll,
see what you're saying, and we can take this back and offer some clarification if needed. And basically just say if the implementing agency seeks design, and construction with the intention of delivering through progressive design build, design, funds can be allocated in design, and don't have to have that guaranteed maximum price achieved yet. We can take that back as a clarification, but I do want to impress that we understand exactly what you're saying, and that is That is going to be possible, but only in the programs that can fund pre-construction.
Of course, yeah. Okay, and I'll read this once we're off the workshop and provide any other feedback as applicable.
Yeah, and I would add that it's a good reminder. Um, it looks like because of the way we're presenting it, it looks like these are kind of like standalone sections that are just floating somewhere. They're embedded in the existing program guidelines under the sections that are listed on the reference handout. So the reason why we didn't go into as much detail on the yellow bullets and just address the specific caveats for TSEP and LPP formulaic is because those program guidelines already establish the standards for allocations for the pre-construction phases that Matthew just covered as well. But we can include a reference back to the sections outlined within those respective guidelines so that it's very clear what does or doesn't apply, Jillian. So great feedback, always really helpful. And yes, absolutely follow up with us and let us know if you have any additional comments or questions about the proposed language.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. I have a couple more questions to address, so I will go with the order that they were received. Don, when recently I was asked about an agreed to price as an alternative to GMP. Can you explain why ATP is not included? I will do another phone a friend with John Prey here, but based on my understanding, um, isn't agreed to price another way that is referred to guaranteed maximum price, or is that functionally a different practice compared to guaranteed maximum price? I just want to clarify.
Are you picking up? Am I picking up the phone? That's the question
Yes,
to me.
yes, that would be great, John.
If anyone else on the line has a comment on that, I'd be curious. But we didn't find a real black and white distinction between the two. It kind of seemed like we've used agreed to price in a lot of our like legacy guideline language in the shop and stuff, but a lot of the things we've been seeing have been talking about guaranteed maximum price, and we didn't see real distinct differences between the two. Although happy to entertain them if you think there is a difference in naming out an agreed to price, but we're not saying guarantee maximum price as if it's something completely different than an agreed to price. Naveen, wouldn't you say that kind of covers what we were going with here?
Yep, exactly. And I think to John's point, if any agencies are using or if agreed to price is being used in practice as a functional equivalent, we would like to understand the context, including which delivery method, which agency type, which statutory authority, if any, that arises under so that we can understand it better. Because like John said, we didn't really find any references identifying whether it's completely separate to GMP or if it's just another colloquial term to refer to GMP. And Don, feel free to follow up or raise your hand if you want to elaborate further. And while we wait for Don, I will move on to Hisham Noemi's question. CCTA is in the same situation as RCTC, but we are using STIP funds, not SB1 funds. Again, because these are Senate Bill 1 guidelines and we're addressing questions related to Senate Bill 1 program guidelines, we can't speak to the STIP guidelines here. But hopefully some of Matthew's questions to responses to Jillian's questions helped clarify the position based off of Senate Bill 1 program guidelines. But if you have any STIP specific questions, feel free to follow up with the STIP program team.
Yeah, and this is just a similar caveat to earlier, Naveen. Hisham, the STIP guidelines that were most recently adopted, I believe, last year, so 2025, those are still in place and standard for all STIP funded and projects to be delivered. So any of this language is not included in that program. But I do anticipate will be considered the next time other programs are opening guidelines development up.
And I noticed, oh, great. So Hisham's question was addressed. I will move on to the next one. And then Sung Moon from Caltrans followed up on our agreed to price question, which is agreed to price is maybe defined in 23 California Regulation 635.502. Thank you for sharing that. We might follow up on that. We will look into it. If anybody else has any other comments related to agreed to price or any other thoughts, please feel free to raise your hand or throw it in the Q&A section, and we'll make note of it and look into it a little bit further. Okay, I'm going to move on to Shelley Kwan's question. Are LPP formulaic and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program accepted from the first bullet in the previous slide that says design build and progressive design build projects will have funds programmed in the construction phase? I'm going to move backwards. So I believe you're talking about this first bullet that's in red that says under programming and allocating projects using alternate delivery methods for projects using the design build, progressive design build, and construction manager general contractor delivery methods, a guaranteed maximum price must be established before construction phase allocation. No, they would not be exempted from the first bullet because, like Matthew was explaining earlier, and I mentioned previously as well, this is specific to construction phase allocation. So you wouldn't be exempted from it. That would apply to all 4 programs as construction phase allocation if you're using one of those alternate delivery methods. Let me know if that answers your question, Shelley. Feel free to follow up if you want a clarification. Oh, Shelley, sorry about that. You meant the first bullet above that, which says for projects using the design build and progressive design build delivery methods, the commission will program the program funds in the construction component of the project. However, the allocation may be a combined amount to include design, right-of-way, and construction. I'm not sure why LPP or TSEP would be exempted from that one either. But based on just your question, I wouldn't. Okay, great. Shelley, go ahead and clarify.
Hi. Yeah, this was just something I was wondering because I think I heard Matthew say that if you had a project in the Formulaic or the TSEP program and you needed to do design, you should program those funds in design so you can allocate them separately and not be subject to the GMP requirement. So you could do that design work needed to reach GMP.
Oh, okay. You're talking about the caveat specifically. Okay, that really helps, Shelley. So yes, in that case, we can add in a note here specific to the local partnership formulaic program and the trade corridor enhancement program specific to that point that we were addressing with Jillian earlier. So yes, absolutely. We would add a caveat there. Does that, any other follow-up, Shelley? I don't know if we lost you. Seems like you're still unmuted.
Am I?
You're still unmuted, yes.
Oh, okay. No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Shelley. Okay. I am going to move on to the next question. This one's also from Don Wynn. For the Solutions for Congested Corridors program construction allocation project, the city partner is using a design construction delivery method. Excuse me, sorry. The city partner is using a design construction delivery method per bus shelter. If I heard correctly, to ask for design funds in the future, this option is available for LPP Formulaic. Are there other grant programs available? So for the Solutions for Congested Corridors project, for the Solutions for Congested Corridors program broadly, that program has always only funded construction. So we have never funded any pre-construction portions. In terms of if you're seeking design funds for an active project that you're building or planning to build, in the SB1 programs, you can pursue funding from the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program if your project meets the eligibility requirements. And then similar concept for Local Partnership Formulaic Program. They also have design funds available. if your program and if your agency is eligible to receive funding based on their guidelines. There are other grant programs available that also fund the design phase. I saw Matthew came off mute, so maybe he can address the other programs that we
Ye-
have available.
Yeah, no, I think I might be reading Dawn's question a little bit differently. I think they're asking about a project that's already been programmed and they know they need design funds. But here we are saying they cannot use design uh, funds for design in SCCP. And I think we're actually saying if you're using an alternate delivery method in SCCP, you are allowed to use funds for design, but they have to be through a construction allocation. So in the example that you're mentioning, Dawn, if this is already programmed in SCCP using design construction or design build delivery method for a bus shelter, you can use you can use portions of your construction allocation for design because of the nature of your delivery method. However, based on this new language that we're providing, in the future, you would be held to a guaranteed maximum price and other provisions that we're now including for alternate delivery methods. So I think for now, the project that you're mentioning is in decent shape. You can still use a portion of your funds for design through a construction allocation. But if you have additional questions on any projects that are already programmed, because I do want to make this clear, this language is looking forward. This language has not been implemented yet. So we are not in a position where we want to undo projects that have already been programmed and allocated and so on and so forth. So for any specific questions on projects that are already underway, we'd be happy to take those more specifically offline and work with you. But in the instance that you're asking, I think your project is still in good shape. I don't want you to assume you would have to go back and seek additional funds for design, unless that is what your question is, and then Naveen is correct. The local partnership formula, STIP, TIRCP, are good options for funding pre-construction. I probably wouldn't suggest TSEP for a bus shelter, but it does fund pre-construction as well.
Thanks, Matthew. I think I was reading that question differently. Hopefully, Dawn, that answered your question. Okay, thank you for both answers. Okay, great. Awesome. Thanks for asking. I will mark that answered. I will move on to the next question from Carrie Robinson. Sandag has been using agreed to price for our current CMGC project. Our team member leading the CMGC project flagged that the industry might be moving away from GMP or guaranteed maximum price because it really isn't a maximum since you still pay for changes. I will make a note of your comment, Carrie, and look into it. Like I said, I'll look into all the notes that we've received on agreed to price just to see if there is something established that we can reference. And then we'll follow up and notify you of any changes made to the guidelines based on that research. I will move on to the next question or comment, which is from Honora Borden. I have a question about timelines. I know that CTC and Caltrans share a goal of timely project delivery with agencies, so I am wondering if you could clarify how finalized the guaranteed maximum price has to be for construction allocations or work packages under these guidelines. Caltrans and CTC staff review of allocation requests takes approximately 2 months prior to the CTC meeting that approves an allocation. And if agencies have to have a final, completely negotiated, down to the penny GMP that far ahead of the allocation, that can create a meaningful project delay that will end up increasing project costs and extending delivery timelines. To date, we've worked with CTC staff and other programs to bring a robust estimate based on the open book cost estimation process to determine the amount for early work package allocations. Thank you for the comment, Honora. If you don't mind coming off mute, I want to clarify what specifically the question is. Is it about, I guess I'm wondering if you're asking about how far ahead you want to notice this information for the CTC or Caltrans? Matthew, if you have an answer, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I think what Honora is asking about is if they have to, and they're absolutely correct. The prep calendar in order to get onto a commission agenda for an allocation is about a 60-day lead time. And we are not going to be able to adjust that because that's just the necessary turnaround time from request at district level to getting on a commission agenda. I think the question is, they may not have a final GMP at the point that they start the paperwork. And so what they've done to date is provide as good of an estimate as they can at the initial request phase. And I think Honora is asking if that is sufficient for getting the request started. Honora, as Naveen mentioned, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you if you have to, if I didn't state that out the way you meant it. But I think that's the question.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes, Matthew, you got it exactly right. The only thing that I would add is that that delay also gets costed into each early works packages by the contractor if they know that each of them will have that 60-day delay where they have to pay their staff but basically stop working. And so it's both a mechanism to make sure that we're able to comply with the required process, but also to keep that project on time and in budget.
Understood. And Naveen, I want you to chime in since I think you probably have more familiarity with this than I do. But I'm just going to ask maybe what is a dumb question, Nora. Based on your question, is it anticipated you would have a GMP before the actual point that commissioners would consider the allocation? You just want to start the request with the estimate, or are you
Yeah.
suggesting it would be okay? So it's really just ensuring that the request can come in with an estimate, understanding a GMP would be achieved before the commission actually votes on the allocation, and if that's sufficient.
Yeah, I would add a +1 to Matthew's comment there and say the language that we're proposing it does not specify that the GMP needs to be fully executed down to the penny weeks before the commission meeting. The intent is that the price certainty exists at the time that the commission acts on the allocation, consistent with how staff and agencies have worked through this practice to date, which is consistent with what you're describing as well. Hopefully that clarifies the response for you, Nora, or did you have anything else to follow up with there?
No, that's everything. It's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. Any other questions on the 2 slides that we covered here on delivery methods? I don't see anything in the Q&A, but if you have any questions or any additional comments on anything we've shared, please feel free to follow up. I'm going to move on to the next slide since we have a little bit more to cover, and I'm sure we'll have questions there too. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, but if at any point you want me to return to a slide that we've already covered or have specific questions or general questions, feel free to chime in or throw them into the Q&A. The second set of changes are updates to the project segmenting sections, which are included in 3 of the 4 program guidelines. This includes the Local Partnership Competitive Program, the Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. These sections already exist in those program guidelines. The proposed changes just add a clear, consistent standard across the programs. Again, proposed changes are shown in bold red on this slide and in the reference document where we shared this material previously, and the full text is in the reference materials as well. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I'll walk the full standard that's going to cut across all 3 programs here because the same standard appears in all 3 programs, just slightly different verbiage to address the point for each of the respective programs. So first, an implementing agency may request to segment a project for delivery purposes, and segmenting does not alter the agency's obligation to deliver the full project funded by the commission consistent with the scope, schedule, cost, and anticipated benefits committed to in the project baseline agreement. Second, consistent with state and federal law, a project may be segmented only if each segment meets all four of the following requirements. The segment is consistent with the project's purpose and need. The segment has independent utility, meaning that it is usable and standalone benefits and constitutes a reasonable expenditure of program funds, even if no additional transportation improvements are made in the project area. The segment connects logical termini, meaning its endpoints are rational endpoints for project improvement and for evaluation of segment benefits. And finally, the segment does not restrict consideration of alternatives for other reasonably foreseeable transportation improvements. Projects are evaluated based on the segments proposed for funding. The nomination must demonstrate that each segment meets these requirements, identify the benefits for each segment, provide a full funding plan for each segment, describe the delivery method for each segment, and include an estimated timeline for the overall project and each segment. The Solutions for Congested Corridors program language is the same standard that I just described, but it's framed for corridors, which is the same it's going to be for the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. The only difference between the Local Partnership Competitive Program and the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program versus the Solutions for Congested Corridors program is that there's a pre-existing condition specific to the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, and that's that last little hanger-on sentence you see on this slide, which reads, proposed projects or segments that complete a corridor as defined in a comprehensive multimodal corridor plan will be prioritized for funding. For those of you that have applied to or are interested in applying to the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, you may already be aware that your project needs to be included in a comprehensive multimodal corridor plan to qualify to apply for funding in the program. And comprehensive multimodal corridor plans are also referred to as CMCPs for short, if that is an easier reference point for folks. This is, again, the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program language, which mirrors the same standard that I addressed previously. The point across all of the three programs is consistency, one segmentation standard applied the same way at nomination and during delivery, regardless of the program funding the project. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions or comments, any kind of feedback that you have about these sections that I just shared about project segmentation, or anything broadly or anything we covered previously. Okay, seeing none, I'm going to move on to the next slide. So we are wrapping up guidelines development this summer. Any feedback from today and written comments that we receive thereafter will inform the final guidelines that will be presented to the Commission at the August Commission meeting. The call for projects follows adoption with project nominations due in the fall and winter of 2026 and program adoption anticipated in summer 2027. As noted on the slide, the timeline is tentative and may be subject to changes, but at this point, we are not currently expecting any. I will again make one note specific to the Solutions for Congested Corridors program only. The Commission will host 2 public hearings for the Solutions for Congested Corridors program to solicit additional comments, one for Northern California on August 3rd, and one for Southern California at the August Commission meeting on August 20th, when the Commission will consider adopting program guidelines. Any questions on the proposed timeline or next steps? Meg Henry has asked if I could please put the slide up about the TSEP project segmenting for a moment. Here you go. It's up now. You're welcome, Meg. And like I said, this is the same information included in the reference document that's also published online on our website. I'm happy to share a quick link to it in case you want to look through it and ask any questions. I have another question from Nicolette Chan. I'm going to move up to LPP competitive. So for LPP competitive program, project segmenting, the slide says a full funding plan is required. For projects with segmented delivery, is it okay to show to be determined sources and remaining funding needs in the funding plan? Will projects be evaluated based on the funding plan for future segments? Nicolette, maybe you can come on off mute and clarify, but just based on the question and how I'm interpreting it. So projects that compete in the local partnership competitive program are always required to have a fully committed funding plan, typically. So if you are segmenting the project before it's programmed, then all of the segments need to show full funding commitments. But if you're segmenting after the project has been programmed, you still need to demonstrate full funding commitments, but you can kind of talk that through about where that funding would come from. I guess I'm trying to understand what any difference would be there based on the segmenting information provided. But Matthew, if you're interpreting it differently, let me know.
Yeah, I'm thinking, and Naveen, your answer is correct. If we're being if all segments are being applied for, right? Like if an implementing agency or an applicant wants to be evaluated on all segments at once, each segment would have to have a full funding plan. Now, if you know from an implementing agency perspective that the project is going to be segmented, and to give you an example, I think a lot of large corridor programs, corridor projects end up being segmented. You know, they're delivered in phases. And in this instance, a segment could be considered a phase. But when we've received phased projects in the past, we've only been asked to evaluate and fund one of those phases, aka segments, and we're not provided with all of the additional segments to deliver the entire corridor, along with the application. So in that instance, if you're only seeking funding for one segment, and you're only asking us to evaluate that one segment as a standalone segment, you only need a full funding plan on that segment. You do not need a full funding plan for the future segments that would be delivered in the future. But just understand that means we will not be evaluating the benefits of the full corridor once it's completely delivered, because those would not be delivered with the LPP competitive programmed funding, if that makes sense. So I think the reason we're answering the question from Naveen's perspective, which I agree with, is in a lot of instances, we included the segmenting language in our guidelines because agencies will seek what is considered a full project, but then they'll segment it within the application, basically breaking it down into smaller pieces. If, for instance, the project isn't competitive enough to receive a full funding from the program, and the applicant is willing to consider less SB1 funding for a smaller segment. In that instance, if we're being asked to potentially fund all segments, every segment needs to have a full funding plan. But if you're not sharing all segments with us in the form of an application, we would not expect you to have a full funding plan for future segments to be delivered at a later time. So it's kind of like if you put it in front of us for evaluation, it needs to be fully funded. If you're not putting it in front of us for a full evaluation, you're only putting like one segment, and you can still tell the story of future segments that are, expected to be delivered. But just know that we will not be evaluating the benefits and the metrics of the fully delivered project, just what you're seeking funding for.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. Thank you, Matthew. Nicolette, if we covered your question, oh, great, we did. Awesome. Thank you, Nicolette. Appreciate it. I'm going to pause and see if there are any other questions on project segmenting specific to any of the programs, which includes the Local Partnership Competitive Program, Solutions for Congested Corridors Program, or the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program. I'm going to give it maybe a couple of seconds before I move on to the next slides. We're basically in closing mode now, so if you do have any specific questions or you want to go back to any of the slides that we covered earlier. Happy to address any questions or respond to any feedback while you have us all here as a captive audience. And then, like Matthew mentioned earlier, and I mentioned earlier, if you have any feedback or comments that you would prefer to share in writing, please send them our way as soon as possible. Ideally, we have limited time between now and the August commission meeting, and we would like to process any questions or feedback as soon as possible and get the guidelines ready for the August commission meeting. Okay, I don't see any hands raised or any Q&A questions, so I'm going to move ahead to my closing dialogue, which is basically thank you so much for joining us this morning. Our contact information is included on the Commission's website, and in these slides, written comments on the proposed language can be sent to us directly, so you can email them directly to Matthew, to me, or to any of the program managers that you see at the Commission. Happy, but we would prefer if you send them to me and Matthew, just because we're working on this directly. And then all of the materials and the recording for this workshop will be posted on the Commission's website. As a quick reminder, this presentation that I just shared with you, including all of the reference materials included in, which is the proposed language, are already posted on the Commission website and have been. And so to go ahead and take a look at them and provide any feedback or comments directly on the document, or just shoot them our way in email. I see there are a couple of questions that arrived during my closing spiel. Dawn, many thanks for hosting this workshop. You are very welcome, Dawn. Thank you for the questions. Shannon Thagard, I apologize, but real quick, where on the website can we find the presentation again? That is a great question, Shannon, because you can find this information on the California Transportation Commission website. If you are on the home page, you can go to meetings and events and scroll down to workshops. And the first workshop listed there is the alternate delivery methods workshop for July 15th. Reference materials are posted therein. We also have another workshop at 1 p.m. today, so not to be confused with the reference materials for that one. Likewise, you can also find all of the materials posted on all of the program page websites. If you're looking for a specific program, just scroll down to workshops and you will see the materials posted under the workshop section for any of the Senate Bill 1 programs, if you are pursuing changes or questions related to that specific program. And then last question that I see here from Carrie Robinson, when would you like any comments by? Thanks again for the presentation. I know people hate it when I say that, but as soon as possible, please. As soon as humanly possible. If you can get them to us by the end of this week, that would be ideal. But if you can get them to us by the end of next week, that would be Friday, I believe July something. I don't have a calendar in front of me, so I don't know the date off the top of my head. Next week, Friday, July 24th. That's one day before my birthday, if that's easy for you to remember. Go ahead and send it to us by Friday, July 24th at the latest so that we can incorporate all final feedback and comments into the program guidelines. But of course, you are welcome to provide comments and feedback until the day of the commission meeting if you choose to. We just want to have it all considered in a timely fashion.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, Naveen, is I agree with the as soon as possible. We are posting final guidelines on July 7th, which for all intent and purpose is what we shared with commissioners at the June commission meeting and what we're discussing in this morning's workshop and what we'll be discussing in this afternoon's workshop. So realistically, if you have suggestions or comments that you would like us to consider and get incorporated into the final guidelines that we post on August 7th for the August commission meeting, they do need to be to us as soon as possible. I think by the end of next week is probably about the latest that we'll be able to accept anything with a practical consideration into the final guidelines that get posted. But as Naveen mentioned, we will take all comments and all suggestions up until the point that commissioners vote to approve the guidelines. It becomes a bit more difficult for us at the staff level to internally consider those comments and questions, vet them through our executive team, and actually get them incorporated into guidelines that are posted. So realistically, as soon as possible.
I don't see any other open questions or comments. I don't see any hands raised. It's 11:08 a.m. You can have just under an hour back of your time. And for those of you who will be joining us for this afternoon's workshop, we'll see you there. Otherwise, we'll see you at the next commission meeting. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week. And like Matthew said, one last call for final feedback. Send it to us as soon as possible. And yeah, have a great rest of your week and your weekend, and we'll see you at the next commission meeting. Bye, everybody.